Pilate discovered the truth far too early. That became the biggest problem of his entire career. Everyone remembers the cross. Almost nobody notices that the real conflict began much earlier. It began the moment Pilate realized Jesus did not deserve to die. From that moment on, the trial was practically over. Everything that followed was something else. And this is where the story stops being a trial and becomes a negotiation. Jerusalem was packed. Passover had brought thousands of pilgrims into the city. The streets were louder, the markets were fuller. Every corner felt crowded, which also meant Rome was becoming increasingly nervous, because Rome had given every governor one remarkably simple assignment: keep the peace. How? That was your problem. If everyone went home quietly, excellent. If the city exploded into a riot, Rome would simply find another governor. Pilate understood that system perfectly. He had not been sent to Judea to settle religious debates. He had been sent to prevent public disasters. Theology was someone else's department. Order was his. Then the religious leaders arrived, not looking for answers, not asking for an investigation, not wondering what was true. They arrived with a verdict already finished. Jesus had already been condemned. They only needed one final detail: Pilate's signature. Slight problem. Pilate preferred evidence, so he started asking questions. The accusations sounded dramatic, the evidence at less impressive. Witnesses struggled to agree. The charges shifted. The urgency felt strangely manufactured. The facts had one annoying habit: they kept defending Jesus. So Pilate questioned him personally. The conversation was unexpectedly calm. No panic, no desperate excuses, no fear. Ironically, the calmest man inside the courtroom was the one on trial. Every answer made Pilate's situation worse. Not because Jesus looked guilty, because he didn't. Eventually, the conclusion became impossible to escape. Jesus was innocent. That should have ended everything. Release the prisoner. Send everyone home. Problem solved. Except it wasn't. Because Pilate no longer had a legal problem. He had a political one. Sometimes finding the truth is surprisingly easy. Living with it is considerably more expensive. Imagine a judge discovering the defendant committed no crime, then spending the rest of the afternoon calculating whether justice was worth losing his career. That was Pilate's morning. He wasn't trying to discover the truth anymore. The truth had already arrived. Now he was calculating its price. Outside, the crowd became louder. Inside, the pressure became heavier. The religious leaders refused to leave. The tension refused to disappear. Every passing minute quietly changed the question. It was no longer, is Jesus innocent? Pilate already knew the answer. The real question had become, how much is innocence worth? Curiously, that question had nothing to do with Jesus. It had everything to do with Pilate, because the greatest battle of that morning was never happening outside the palace. It was happening inside the governor himself, and the most dangerous enemy Pilate would face that day never entered the courtroom. It had been sitting quietly inside his own mind all along. Pilate never really needed to decide if Jesus was innocent. That part was already clear. He needed to decide if innocence still mattered when the room became dangerous. And that is a much more uncomfortable question, because truth is easy to respect and when nobody important is angry about it. But once the priests were standing there, the crowd was growing louder. The city was already tense and Rome was always watching from a distance. Truth suddenly became very expensive. Pilate was not dealing with one problem. He was dealing with several. Religious leaders demanding condemnation, a crowd becoming easier to ignite, a prisoner who did not look dangerous, a city full of pilgrims, and an empire that had exactly zero patience for local drama. Rome's policy was beautifully simple. Govern however you want. Just do not let the province become a headline. In other words, be firm, be practical, and please do not make Caesar receive an unpleasant report before lunch. Pilate understood the assignment. He knew that Jesus was not the real threat in front of him. Jesus was calm. Jesus was restrained. Jesus was not organizing a riot, which made the situation deeply inconvenient, because the people accusing him were much louder than the man being accused. And in politics, volume has a terrible habit of pretending to be truth. On paper, Pilate was the most powerful man in Jerusalem. He had Roman authority, soldiers, legal power, the right to release, the right to condemn. Very impressive. On paper. In practice, he was surrounded by people who had already decided what he should do. The religious leaders were not asking Pilate to judge. They were asking him to cooperate. There is a difference. Judgment searches for truth. Cooperation signs the document and hopes everyone leaves. Pilate could see the trap. If he released Jesus, the leaders could stir the crowd. If the crowd erupted, Rome could blame Pilate. If Rome blamed Pilate, well, suddenly defending an innocent man might become a very expensive career decision. So the question quietly changed. It was no longer, what is right? It became, what will this cost me? That is where many people lose, not because they cannot recognize the truth, but because they start calculating the consequences of defending it. It is like a CEO knowing exactly what the ethical decision is, then spending the entire meeting searching for a version of it that does not upset the board. Very noble, very strategic, very tragic. Pilate was trapped between conscience and convenience had better political connections. The truth was standing right in front of him, but pressure was standing all around him. That was the real problem. The problem was never discovering the truth. The problem was surviving after choosing it. Because truth itself was not expensive, the consequence of standing beside it was, and soon the crowd would do what crowds often do best. Take one private fear and turn it into a public decision. Most people think this is the moment Pilate changed his mind. It wasn't. By the time the crowd started shouting, Pilate had already begun negotiating with his own conscience. And that changes everything. Because crowds rarely create cowardice, they simply reveal the cowardice that was already growing in silence. The shouting did not confuse Pilate, it exposed him. By now the facts had not changed. Jesus was still innocent, the evidence was still weak, the accusations were still inconsistent. Nothing about the case was different, only the pressure was. And pressure has a remarkable talent. It makes convictions feel surprisingly negotiable. The priests understood something Pilate was slowly discovering. This was no longer a legal discussion. It was a political countdown. Every passing minute increased the cost of releasing Jesus. The louder the crowd became, the more expensive the truth looked. That is usually how fear works. It rarely argues with facts, it simply changes the price tag. Pilate was still asking questions, still searching for another option, still hoping someone else would solve the problem for him. Because sometimes people already know the right decision. They just keep looking for one that hurts less. History has a funny habit. It remembers the final decision. It often forgets the hundreds of smaller decisions that made the final one inevitable. Nobody trades away a clear conscience all at once. It happens one compromise at a time, one excuse at a time, one delay at a time, one calculation at a time, until eventually, the decision feels almost automatic. Curiously, the crowd seemed less desperate to discover the truth than Pilate seemed desperate to keep his position. That is an uncomfortable detail, because the governor had more authority than anyone in the city, yet he was behaving like the only person without any choices. Power, it turns out, does not automatically produce courage. Sometimes it simply gives fear a bigger office. Imagine defending a principle through an entire board meeting, only to realize you will be the only person voting for it. Suddenly, sir, that principle begins to sound much more flexible, not because it became weaker, because standing beside it became lonelier. Pilate was reaching that point. The crowd was not rewriting his judgment. His judgment had already been made. The crowd was rewriting his priorities. Justice slowly moved down the list. Self-preservation quietly climbed to the top. That was the real turning point. Not when people started shouting, but when Pilate decided that protecting himself mattered more than protecting the innocent. From that moment forward, the outcome became increasingly predictable. The famous scene everyone remembers was no longer the beginning of the fall. It was simply the first moment the fall became visible. And the most symbolic gesture in the entire story was only a few moments away. Then came the scene everyone remembers. Pilate washed his hands. For centuries, that gesture has been treated like a symbol of neutrality, as if water could turn a decision into an unfortunate misunderstanding. Small problem. Neutrality does not usually need a public demonstration. People who are truly innocent do not normally pause the room, bring out water, wash their hands, and basically announce, "Just so everyone knows, this is not my fault." Very convincing. Pilate was not washing his hands because he felt peaceful. He was washing them because he knew exactly what he had just allowed. That is what makes the scene so uncomfortable. The gesture was not proof of innocence. It was evidence of awareness. He knew. He knew the accusations were weak. He knew the pressure had won. He knew Jesus did not deserve death. And he knew his name was now attached to the decision. The water touched his hands. It never touched the choice. That is the problem with symbolic gestures. They can look clean from a distance, while changing absolutely nothing underneath. Pilate wanted separation without responsibility. He wanted the sentence to happen without the sentence belonging to him. A very popular human strategy. Sign the order, blame the room, call it complicated, move on. Except history has a rude habit. It remembers who had authority when authority mattered. Pilate could point at the crowd. He could point at the priests. He could point at the tension in Jerusalem. He could point at Rome's expectations. And yes, all of those pressures were real. But pressure explains a decision. It does not erase it. Washing his hands did not release Jesus. Washing his hands did not stop the sentence. Washing his hands did not protect the innocent. It only gave Pilate a scene where he could pretend the responsibility had somewhere else to go. And that is where the irony becomes almost painful. The water cleaned his skin. It could not clean his surrender. It is like signing an order, then publishing a statement saying, "I personally disagreed with the order I signed." Interesting. The signature remains yours. That is what Pilate's gesture really revealed. Not innocence, not neutrality, not moral distance. It revealed a man trying to stand outside a decision he had already made from the inside. The famous scene took all the attention, but the real defeat had happened earlier. It happened when truth became negotiable. It happened when innocence became inconvenient. It happened when Pilate decided that doing the right thing was too expensive, and then looked for a way to feel less responsible for the cost. The hands became clean. The choice did not. And that is why this gesture still feels so sharp centuries later, because it shows one of the oldest tricks in human history, trying to keep the benefits of a decision while escaping the blame for making it. And that is exactly why the title of this story is so uncomfortable. Jesus did not die because Pilate failed to recognize the truth. Jesus died because Pilate discovered how expensive the truth could become. That was the real trial, not Jesus. Pilate's. Everyone inside that palace had been watching one man stand before a governor. But another trial had been unfolding the entire time, a quieter one, a far more familiar one, the trial between conscience and convenience. By the end of the morning, the facts had never changed. Jesus was still innocent. The evidence was still weak. The accusations were still driven by envy and fear. Truth had remained remarkably consistent. Pilate had not. That is what makes this story so unsettling. The villain of the moment was not ignorance. It was compromise. Step by step, Pilate had watched the cost of doing the right thing rise higher and higher. The priests increased the pressure. The crowd increased the noise. Politics increased the risk. Fear increased the price. And eventually, the price felt higher than his conscience was willing to pay. Everything happened exactly as the outline of that morning suggested. The truth appeared. The pressure grew. Fear took control. Conscience stepped back. The decision was made. History changed forever. Notice what never happened. Pilate never stood up and announced, "I have decided that Jesus is guilty." Because he couldn't. He knew better. Instead, he chose something much more common. He acted against what he already knew. And history is filled with moments exactly like that. The greatest failures rarely happen because people cannot recognize what is right. They happen because doing what is right suddenly becomes very expensive. It is easy to defend truth when truth costs nothing. It is much harder when it threatens a promotion, a reputation, a friendship, a position, or an entire career. That is why Pilate's story still feels surprisingly modern. Most people will probably never govern a Roman province, thankfully, but almost everyone will eventually face a moment where comfort stands on one side and conviction stands on the other. The details change. The question never does. How much is the truth worth, when you are the one paying for it? Pilate answered that question, not with his words, with his decision. And decisions tend to speak much louder. Looking back, Pilate did not ultimately lose to the priests. He did not lose to the crowd. He did not even lose to Rome. He lost the moment he decided that protecting himself mattered more than protecting the truth he already recognized. That was his defeat. Long before the cross, long before the washing of hands, long before history remembered his name, because once truth becomes something to negotiate, it eventually becomes something to betray. That is why this story has never really been about one Roman governor. It has always been about the uncomfortable price of knowing exactly what is right and deciding it costs too much. Maybe that is why people still remember Pilate, not because he failed to find the truth, but because he knew.